Okay, welcome to everyone who's attending today. Thank you for coming to the Paxate Academy ITagree discussion about risk and how we can hopefully help you mitigate some of those in your business. Anne is going to give us a bit of her background and why she knows all sorts of things about this and how she can help us. Hopefully everyone enjoys today's session and learns some great things that they can use in their business. I'll hand over to you now, Anne.
Thanks, Maria. And hello, everyone. It's great to be here. It's actually my first time presenting to Paxate partners, so I'm very delighted to have this opportunity. So today we're talking about business risk, and I'm going to firstly identify a whole bunch of areas of business risk. Don't want to upset your day, but we need to see what this business risk is. And then we'll look at, how contracts can be used to manage risk and to navigate change. And I'll give you some examples. We'll go through what I see as the three key ways that you should be looking at your customer contracts in terms of giving you best levels of protection with examples along the way. Okay, so I'll share my screen now and we'll get stuck into it. Okay. So first of all, I would just like to begin by acknowledging the amazing services that you all provide. I have talked here about managed service providers, and I do generally talk about managed service providers through this presentation. If you are not a managed service provider, if you're a system integrator or providing some other sorts of services, I fully expect you'll still find this relevant and useful, but I'm just, in most of the places I'll be talking about managed service providers. So, as I said, to acknowledge, first of all, the amazing services being provided, the years of experience, the learning, and you only need to go to any event and see that learning taking place and the collegiality and, always wanting to stay up to date with the technology and so on, which is really impressive. I don't think you see that in necessarily every industry, the passion that you guys bring to your work. The undoubted expertise and, the problem-solving skills. So, I just firstly want to acknowledge all of that you're doing. And what I do see is all of that coming into play, and yet you guys are often carrying a lot of business risk. So while on the surface things look great, often there is that concern about business risk and what can we do about it, hence this topic today. So whilst, yes, the amazing services being provided and looking after your clients so well, there are quite a bunch of challenges that you're all facing. So I'd like to go through some of those challenges and spend a little bit of time on this particular page. So first of all, risks when reselling cloud services. And I'm just going to pull out some of these in random sort of order. So risks when reselling cloud services. And this is really a key risk area that we hear from MSPs and from other types of partners is, what is my responsibility when I'm reselling cloud services? Because it's such a key part of what you're doing, using and reselling cloud services. And where does your responsibility begin and end? How can you actually address the inevitable risk that's involved in dealing with cloud services all the time? And, one key example is around Microsoft, and a lot of you will be reselling Microsoft 365, some of you other Microsoft cloud services, Azure as well. And, along came the Microsoft NCE changes in August the year before last. And that really threw a lot of partners, I think fundamentally because of the payment risks, but behind that also so many areas of You know, what do we now have to tell our customers around the ability only to increase and not to decrease the number of licenses they have during any particular subscription term? What happens on expiry? And a whole raft of things that came into play with those Microsoft NCE changes, bringing a new type of risk to reselling Microsoft Cloud services. Cyber attacks, you know, all of these are big items here. And probably would deserve a whole topic in themselves, some of them. But so I'm just spending a little bit of time on each one here. Cyber attacks, a really obvious concern for a lot of the industry, especially as, you know, you're the front face to your customers. And so when they suffer, and, you know, if and when they suffer any cyber incident, they're going to be looking to you initially for a resolution, and possibly also to point the finger as to why has this happened? I thought you were looking after me. You know, and of course, as we've seen with a lot of the bigger cyber attacks coming through the MSPs, because, you know, you've got the access to your customers and contact details and so on. So so a lot of that is making the MSPs a big target for the hackers as well. So all of these are the different types of challenges faced by MSPs. If we look at some other ones, unpaid work. You know, yes, I know you all love the sort of work that you're doing, but you're not charities. Most of the time, you know, you want to get paid for your work. So it's a matter of how can you address that in an appropriate way, especially where maybe the customer has a different view of what some of the work that you do should be valued at. If they say, oh, that was just a quick phone call, or you told me how to do that within 5 minutes, but it's actually immense value that you're providing. And if you take all of those pieces of 15 minutes here and half an hour there, alongside all of the work that you've put into actually having the knowledge to know what exactly to do in any particular situation, you can feel that, you know, there's not good value being provided in return for the work that you're putting in to keeping up to date and so on. The out of scope is an age-old issue. I've been working with the IT industry in a lawyer capacity since the early 90s, just showing my age there, but out of scope has always been an issue, whether that's in project work, now whether that's with managed services. Out of scope and being able to draw that line as to what's in scope and what's out of scope seems to be an eternal issue, but we can do a much better job of it, and that certainly pays dividends if you put the time into it. So the out of scope requests, the work that gets handled that's out of scope, perhaps it feels easier just to do the work rather than to address it, but then in turn, have you got that covered in your contract anyway? Moving on from there, you know, some of the bigger things, you'll see the yellow item, the risk of legal proceedings. And there is perhaps naturally a view that business risk is all about, you know, that risk of legal proceedings. But, you know, it's actually not. In more than 25 years, I've had only 3 clients that have faced legal proceedings. And all of those were settled out of court. But have I seen the ups and downs and all of these sorts of issues? Absolutely. Examples of those are everywhere. So that risk of legal proceedings does sit there and hover and sit there like a dark cloud, perhaps. But, you know, it is one of a bunch of other business risks, sorry to say. Another couple of things here, and one positive one, which can be turned into a positive, that missed upsell opportunities. So the missed upsell opportunities, the flip side of that is there are potentially upsell opportunities that are sitting there that can just be uncovered a little bit through some of the techniques that I'll be talking about soon. And of course, you'll have your own techniques as well with sales initiatives and so on. But some of those missed upsell opportunities are simply because the customer may believe that you're already providing certain services. Alongside some of these business risks is, of course, some of you will be looking in the future to potentially exit your business. And so what is the impact of all of this? If you've got reduced revenue, how does that play out on the value of your business on an exit? Likewise, how does that play out on your general ability to grow the business if you've got all of these sorts of things at play or a mixture of them that might be impacting your business. Okay, here we've got a rock climber, not particularly an activity that I would like to take part in, but I know that some people enjoy it. And this particular rock climber is sensibly using ropes. I recall, and some of you might have seen the movie Free Solo, where Alex Honnold, it's a documentary about his climbing, and he ultimately in that documentary climbs El Capitan, which is 3,000 feet high, and it's certainly not got these sorts of crevices and stepping stones, as it were. And what's more, he doesn't use any ropes at all. So certainly that would be absolutely terrifying. Of course, in both instances, with Alex Honnold, he did immense amounts of training. And so that is, I guess, the way that he managed his risk. He analysed every single part of that 3,000-foot climb. Here, the climber is a more regular type of climber using ropes, and he's using those ropes to manage risk. So guess what? Needless to say, I'm going to say to you that contracts are your way, in a very, very important way, of managing the risks that I've just been talking about. And, that is the case so long as you've got the right sort of contracts and so long as you're using them properly. Okay, so some of the common risk areas, and I expect that most of these will resonate with you. Customers not taking up your recommendations. This is a big issue for a lot of IT companies. The customer might be putting off a particular project, putting off doing what you're recommending to them, or they might be taking a cheaper option, but nonetheless, they're not taking up your recommendations. How does that sit in terms of your responsibility? So that's a common risk area. Another one is assumptions. Now, customers naturally will make assumptions, they'll have expectations, and unfortunately, a lot of the time, those assumptions mean that they expect the partner to be doing a lot more. In their mind, the partner is already doing a lot more and is looking after everything, even though that customer may not have signed up to the particular service offered by the partner for that to be the case. The out-of-scope work that I've already mentioned, leading to, in a lot of cases, revenue leakage. So revenue leakage really is a big aspect around a number of those sorts of business issues, whether it's revenue leakage, whether it's time that's being spent on things that you can't be charging for, or indeed the value of your business. So the revenue leakage is a very key part of business risk. And as I mentioned earlier, that risk associated with reselling third-party cloud services, Microsoft 365 amongst them. So the message is clear here. You can use agreements to manage risk, so long as you're using the right agreements and using them properly. And I think it's fair to say, because a lot of MSPs in particular who are reselling a lot of cloud services, there's a nervousness that goes around that. No matter what size that MSP is, there's a nervousness. And I really don't like seeing MSPs in that situation of feeling we've got all this risk and we really don't have a way to manage it. So I'm telling you today there is a way to manage it, and it's certainly quite readily available to you if you just view things in this way. A second key area is about change. And of course, change is constant. I talk to a lot of MSPs. Some will say, we have used the same contracts for 5 years. There doesn't seem to be any issue. Okay, I will say to them, have your services changed? Now think about it. Your services and the way you're delivering them, your service commitment is a very, very key part of what should be in your agreement. It's what you're agreeing with the customer. So when your services change, you should be thinking we need a corresponding change in our agreement, because what we're agreeing to do is different. So if you think of it in quite basic terms like that, Your contract is an agreement. It's a legally enforceable agreement, but it's an agreement that recognises this is what you are doing, this is the customer's obligations, which can extend, beyond simply payment. The customer has other obligations as well, but essentially the contract is your agreement for what you are doing. Of course, there are other things in there as well. So types of change that are really common are market changes, and we've mentioned already the Microsoft NCE changes, but there are other types of market changes that go on as well. Every time I go to an event, there are new things going on in the market, and this often plays out into, changes needed in agreements. There are changes taking place in your customers. So whether that means you're attracting a larger type of customer, or it means that your customers are growing and wanting different types of things in the contracts, whether it means your customers are maturing in their understanding, because that also happens. So all of those sorts of things mean changes to contracts. And then we flip to the right-hand side of the slide and what's happening with your own services. You could be refining your service, but you could also be offering new services. And at the moment, and I say at the moment, it's been ongoing for quite a little while now, and I don't see much into it, the MSP offering cybersecurity services. And in Australia, of course, the importance, the benefits in aligning those cybersecurity services with Essential 8. But we're seeing quite an array of different cybersecurity services that MSPs are offering to their customers, and so therefore, of course, they need agreements. And cybersecurity being an area that's particularly fraught with risk, that's something that I would encourage you to really focus on. So let's move on and talk about what the contract is for. And this is, when I first started going to events in the US a number of years ago, I met with a lot of MSPs, and some of them would say, well, we have a short contract, we've never had a problem, and if we're sued, we're just going to walk away and we'll just collapse our business, this sort of thinking. We also get the thinking of, well, yes, I've got a contract and I see it primarily, the purpose of it is that if we're ever sued, we'll have the contract, and that kind of thinking is really quite a reactive view of the protection that's actually available. So we get this guy with his head in his hands, concerned about business risk. My only avenue is to make sure that my contract is there in case I'm ever sued. Meanwhile, he's also thinking nothing's ever happened, so it's probably a low-level risk. Our clients trust us. Our customers don't even read the contract, so why would we put much effort into it? And, it's all legalese. So in response to some of those issues, if you're relying on trust, I would strongly suggest to you that you should move away from that thinking. Of course, trust is important, it's essential, but if that's all you're relying on, that's really insufficient. Your customers don't read the contract, they should be, or at least reading the part that lets them know what your service commitment is to them, how much they're paying, the basis of payment, the terms, some of those really important things. If they don't want to read about your limitation of liability, your position on confidentiality and those sorts of things, that's typically fine, that's up to them. But you do want them to understand the nuts and bolts of what you're doing for them and in return, what their obligation is. So I would say don't be pleased if your customers don't read the contract. Yes, you might be getting a quick sale, but it may cost you more time and money in the future. And the legalese one, what I would say to that is, don't have legalese in your contract. It should be a contract that makes sense to you and, really importantly, makes sense to your customers. So if it's full of legalese, likewise, if it's full of technical jargon, it's actually not being very helpful from that perspective. So if this is your thinking, I would encourage you to think a little bit differently about your contract and what it's for. And we'll move on to this slide here, showing Firstly, the guy on the left taking a proactive view about protection. He's got all his safety gear and so on. And I talk about proactive and reactive protection. Proactive, if you think about a contract, there's certainly a part which is for your reactive protection. And that is the part that if everything, turned to a worst case scenario and you face legal proceedings, yes, you would have your liability, limitation of liability, your indemnities, your warranties, and so on. What I would call the legal part of the contract, the part that perhaps only the lawyers fully understand. But there's a big part of the contract that really provides you an opportunity to be proactive about risk. And that is where I think a lot of MSPs could be well served to put more, be more clear about the details in that proactive part, because that is really a part where you can get a huge benefit in terms of mitigating your potential business risk. And I saw this over the years, as I said earlier, a very, very small number of situations actually going to litigation or even to dispute, but so many opportunities, examples of where partners should have made more money from a project but did not. They did not use their contract in a way to be proactive about their business risk protection. So what's your approach? And I'm not talking about the proactive, the reactive, just simply what's your approach to contracts? We see a lot of David's, the guy in the middle. He's got agreements, he knows they're important, but a lot of the time the agreements he's using are out of date. And what I mean by out of date there, yes, they can be out of date with the law, but more likely they're going to be out of date with the services you're providing, with what's going on in the market, with what your customers are expecting, and with the services that you're providing in terms of are you providing new services, or are your services, have they been refined since those contracts have been written? So a lot of the time we're seeing MSPs with terms and conditions that they may have got from somewhere. They don't necessarily remember the original source. They have played around with them. They may not have done anything for the last 5 or 10 years to modify them to bring them up to date. And this is what they're relying on. So it's really, this is why the guy in the middle's got his hands on his head, because it is a concern to him, but he doesn't actually know what necessarily to do about it. The person on the right, Sarah, uses a local lawyer, and oftentimes that local lawyer is doing their property lease, their employment agreements, their company law work. They may or may not know very much about how the IT industry works. And, lawyers, of course, provide a great service. I've been a lawyer many, many years myself, but it is on a bespoke basis, and it most often is on a reactive basis. So it's expensive, it's time consuming, and I think a lot of the time we've heard, people have gone to their local lawyer, they would spend a lot of time and money explaining what it is that they want. And so Sarah on that side probably doesn't use the lawyer as much as what they might if that lawyer understood more about the industry. The person on the left, Robert, is our customers trust us. And if you're in that camp, I would strongly encourage you to do something about that, because having no agreements at all is a dangerous place to be. Nearly as bad as having out-of-date agreements, but not quite as bad depending on what's in those out-of-date agreements. So the Roberts of this world, we are finding, are becoming increasingly concerned with business risk, given the huge reliance on cloud services. But the Davids and the Sarahs also knowing that they're probably what they're using is not quite right. So I would invite you to have a think about, where are you sitting in all of this? Are you a Robert? Are you a David? Are you Sarah? And, and in light of what I've just been talking about with the proactive and reactive, and the need to change your contracts to align with your services in the market and what your customers are demanding, where are you sitting in all of that?
I've just got a question, Anne, from Matthew.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Just sorry. There we go. Matthew, your mic should be able to be used if you'd
Yeah,
like
no,
to.
I'm fine. Sorry, guys. I'm having technical issues at my end. I'm fine. I'm just finally getting some listening time in, and thank you
No
for
problem. Okay.
All good.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'm coming now to the first of the three. I said I would be covering three areas which to my mind and my experience, if you can address each of these three things in the way that you use contracts, you will be significantly reducing your business risk. The first, I would start by introducing with the barrier of expertise. And what this is about is the green shirt guy on the left, the IT guy, this is you. You've got all the skills, you and your team have got all the knowledge, the experience. The barrier of expertise is to recognize that your customers have a very, very low level of understanding of the services that you're providing compared to you. Okay, so they may have some understanding, but it's nowhere near to the level of your understanding. And if we start to recognize that barrier of expertise and perhaps put yourselves to the extent that you're able to think like, this is what the customer understands of what's going on, this is where a lot of problems are caused. And, you know, the customer here is signing up to the MSP because they can easily see that you've got the skills, knowledge, and experience. They trust you. But as I mentioned earlier, trust alone is not sufficient. Trust is important, it's essential, but it's not sufficient in itself. And in fact, it's the cause of many problems. So if we can recognize this barrier of expertise and start to break it down in terms of putting to customers agreements that they can understand, putting to them your descriptions in ways that they can understand without the technical jargon, the acronyms, speaking to them in a way that really makes sense to them and making sure that they understand, you know, because things like data backup, just that area, you know, yes, we're doing data backup. What does the customer understand is going on there? What data? And, you know, on what basis is it being backed up? Just a very simple little example. So we come along to Amy, and Amy was a CEO. Her business, well, she still is in business, I believe, in the US. And when I met her, she said, we don't really have a problem with contracts. The problems only start once the contract is signed. And she said at that point, you know, we've landed this great customer. We get them to sign the contract. And after that, you know, our team is working really hard to look after that customer. They're handling out of scope work at no additional charge. There are lots of grey areas, she said, in our contract, and they seem to work against us because we're always working late to deliver. We're always going that extra mile to keep our customers happy. Now, that's great. Of course, so many of you are, you know, in your DNA, you want to go that extra mile. You want to get things resolved. But if that means you're doing out of scope work, then that should be recognised. So what Amy was finding is, and they had moved over the 20-year period from being more of a break fix to managed services, as many of you probably have, and that nice monthly revenue and the nice profitability from that monthly revenue just wasn't quite coming out the way Amy had expected because of these sorts of issues. On top of that, just before I met her, they had received a dispute from a client for over a $30,000 Azure bill. So this was adding to all the sorts of problems that were going on. And really what Amy needed to see was that she actually did have a lot of problems with contracts, because as I said earlier, you know, your contract is your agreement with the customer. What are you doing? What are they doing? And helping the customer to understand the basis on which you're supplying your service commitment. And so the customer understanding what's in scope and what's out of scope is really quite a key part of that. I think a lot of the time customers certainly wouldn't expect you to work for free, they probably don't realise that some of the things they're asking you to do are out of scope. So it's up to you to set things out very clearly. And, I'd really encourage you to scrutinise what you're putting into your managed services agreements and what you're explaining to customers. And of course, the two things should be in sync. Once Amy started using agreements that did reflect what she really felt was included in their managed service and what was not, and being able to then delineate, well, this is actually a project, the profitability that she was expecting from her managed service, unsurprisingly, started to emerge. Now, looking at this from a kind of a metrics point of view, which is always important, one of the things around revenue leakage is, at first, often when we have discussions with partners around that, they'll be a little bit defensive. We don't have that problem. And this was a particular discussion I had recently with a partner in the UK, as it turns out. Don't have any problem around revenue leakage. Everything is running smoothly. We just need some new contracts. 5 minutes later, actually, in that case, it was a UK partner, it was £11,000 a month, not dollars. I've changed it to dollars here. They said to me, actually, because I just carried on talking about the revenue leakage issues, it's about £11,000 a month, the guy said to me. A few minutes after that, he said, actually, it's probably about £200,000 a year. So this is a lot of money. Now, if you look at it in terms of your bottom line or near the bottom line, I happened to see a little video that James Davis from Pax8 Academy put up on Monday on LinkedIn. And at the end of the video, he says the EBITDA industry average is 6 as a percentage of revenue is 6%. So what we're seeing with partners is that their revenue leakage is at least 5%. And that's volunteered. Those numbers are volunteered to us by partners. I'm not putting that to them. They are often coming to us with that sort of number. So if you think about it in that sense, if the industry average is 6% of gross revenue and you're missing out on potentially upwards of 5%, you can quite easily double your EBITDA by simply reducing revenue leakage. So by tightening up on all of those sorts of areas that I discussed earlier in the presentation, those are all revenue leakage areas, which if you can tighten them up, then we'll often go straight to that bottom line. So I've talked there about Amy and that situation, which is really about, to give it a label, it's about aligning expectations. So what is your expectation? What is your customer's expectation? And making sure that's crystal clear in your agreements. The second and really important way of reducing your business risk through contracts is to recognise that you're providing quite a range of different types of services. Now, everyone introduces themselves as a managed service provider, but underneath that, of course, there's a whole range of different services that are being provided, managed services being one. And often, of course, it is a centerpiece of the service offering that you have, but there are a range of other services. We've seen that increase in the cybersecurity services that are being offered. Naturally, most MSPs, all MSPs, no, most, especially since NCE, are offering Microsoft 365. Some are letting their customers buy direct now to avoid those risks. But I think by and large, most are still reselling Microsoft Cloud services and reselling other third-party services, whether as part of the managed service or whether as part of the cybersecurity services or just separately. Doing project work, providing BCDR or just straight backup, private cloud hosting, VoIP and internet, partnering, the list goes on and on. So it's not simply the case that you could say, I need a new contract, I need a new MSA. And by the way, that MSA term is used a lot of the time now as a managed services agreement, but traditionally, of course, as a master services agreement, which is a totally different thing. But it's important to see that providing all these different services, they're all very different. Your service commitment is different. What you need from the customer is different. The payment terms are different. All sorts of things are different. The risk profile is different. And so to use one agreement for everything really misses the boat enormously, and also immediately puts a lot more risk onto you than what is necessary. Because if you're presenting one agreement to a customer, they naturally then can assume, especially if they don't read the contract, that you're then responsible for everything. Good, I've got my IT company signed up. They're now responsible for everything. And whether or not, if you actually turn to the contract, not that you hopefully ever need to, but that it would be clear that you're not responsible for everything. It's all those assumptions and expectations that can make your life difficult along the way and less profitable. So the general agreements, they're really not helpful at all. The agreements that are not specific to services. So, the T's and C's, the T's and C's. And someone joked with me recently, they had T's and C's, and, there was something, I'm sure they were joking that, on completion of the task, you'll have to remove the scaffolding because this particular partner had taken the terms and conditions from a totally, totally different industry, of course. And the same is true with out-of-date agreements. So if you've been using the same agreement for years, that does tend to be an area of business risk right there. Now, so, from the previous slide, I hope it's apparent to you that you should be using different types of contracts for different types of services. And if we have a look at third-party services and cyber attacks, which are, quite a hot topic, shall we say, at least, what do your vendors say? Because if you're reselling, for example, cybersecurity services, what level of responsibility are you taking for those services? And if we look back, as I do, and probably I'm one of the very few people that do, at what vendors say, and I've just pulled out a couple of examples on a no-names basis in terms of who the vendors are, but you really would find much the same in a lot of vendor contracts. So this is from the first example from a firewall vendor. They give no warranty, no representation or indemnity that the products will detect, identify or disable all or any specific harmful programs, viruses or harmful components. So these are actual words taken from that firewall vendor's agreement. So not a great deal of comfort there. Now let's say you are reselling that firewall. What level of responsibility do you think it would be appropriate for you to take? Well, given the vendor's position on this, I hope you would see that you should not be taking any responsibility really at all, and indeed certainly not more than what that vendor is taking. Now, sometimes you might get pushback, of course, from the customer, but it's really about educating the customer. And in that sense, as reselling a third-party service, you're an intermediary. It's not appropriate or justifiable for you to be taking a whole lot more risk on than what the vendor is themselves. We look at the RMM vendor situation, we find much the same, that there is, in this particular one I looked at, there was a limited 30-day warranty, very limited. They're not excluding anything that they can't exclude by law, which, yes, it's good for them to say that, but they can't actually do that anyway. And they're certainly not taking any responsibility for accuracy, for reliability, for security, for loss or corruption of data, for continuity or absence of defect. So that also doesn't give much comfort. So why I've put these on, and I haven't used this slide previously, it's a new one, but I just really wanted to bring it right to the surface that if you're reselling third-party cloud services, as most of you will be, why would you take responsibility for those services? Because your vendors are certainly not. Now, a lot of the time we see that MSPs are reselling cloud services with effectively a line item on an invoice. Now, I hope that you've heard enough from me already today to recognise that I'm going to say that's not sufficient. It does give you indeed quite a lot of risk. And this situation of Jonathan, so Jonathan actually was a partner that we worked with. I'm using this as a forward example for this year. But Jonathan resells endpoint protection and other third-party services. The new customer, let's say you're Jonathan. You're selling that customer some endpoint protection this month, and you're putting that price on your invoice. No contract between you and that customer for that reselling. Now, time ticks along. The customer is paying that monthly amount to you, and you are simply reselling that. In your mind, and in actual fact, you are reselling that service to them. Along comes October, and that customer suffers a cyber incident. They thought they were protected. But, so they call on Jonathan, they call on you, and you quickly want to get that resolved. Of course, perhaps you're a little bit nervous that you might have some sort of responsibility, but you tend to want to help your customer anyway. Now, the customer is not happy. And this Jonathan example has actually happened. So their customer was very unhappy, even though they worked really hard to sort things out. Along comes the next month, the customer disputed the invoice. And so this is the type of situation that actually quite commonly plays out. And Jonathan, they think Jonathan should bear the cost of all that work. So, Jonathan, again, wanting to keep the customer happy, he's got some difficult decisions and discussions, but a lot of the time might let that go because he does want to keep the customer happy. But at the same time, he can be very nervous potentially about legal issues resulting from that. And also it does have a detrimental impact to the relationship. Now, if Jonathan had used the right sort of contract for the reselling and had used a contract for any services that they might provide in the event of a cyber incident, then all of a sudden you're making things much clearer to the customer about the basis on which you're reselling that third-party service. Now, here it is in a diagram form. You've got all the vendors, and I do hear this a lot around, and some of this could be around the Microsoft Cloud services as well. Well, if you look at this line here, here's the contract. Of course, there's a contract in place. There's this contract, and if this is Microsoft, this is the Microsoft customer agreement. Isn't that what that's for? Well, as you can see from this diagram, there's a big gap here. There's often not the contract in place for the reselling, whether it's cybersecurity services, whether it's Microsoft Cloud services, whether it's backup services from third parties, and so on. So this is your business risk sitting right here. And if you are not backing up and taking on the business protection that you can, that's available to you, then you're going to have potential issues here, the basis on which you're reselling that, or if anything actually occurred. So as I've said about showing you the vendor terms, or just a couple of small examples, who should be responsible for performance of those third-party services? Not the managed service provider. Okay, and I think if you can delineate and put boundaries around your reselling activity, this is what we're doing, is reselling to you. Here are the services that we're providing that sit alongside that. Then we are getting that separation and immediately getting a strong degree of business protection. So it's about clarifying your role there as an intermediary, not taking on more responsibility than what the vendors are. Now, if we just jump over to the next example, which looks similar, but if you notice at the top, it's using third-party cloud services. So in this situation, let's say an RMM, again, here is the vendor's terms with you for using that particular service. What are your terms with the customer? Because you're using that for the benefit of the customer. And so how, therefore, are you protecting yourselves? And that's where you need a contract as well. Now, you might think if we've got all this nice and clear, and we've got the boundaries around each of our services with nice different contracts, everything should be fabulous. But there is one more really key piece, and that is, how are your decisions being made? And what I talk about here is processes and agreements, and to recognise that your agreements should in fact reflect your processes. So don't put things into your agreements, or don't allow things to be in your agreements that don't reflect how you're actually working. That would really not make any sense. But likewise, then what's in your agreements should be how you're operating. So keep those two things in sync. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that you have your service delivery teams, open the contract every time they do something. That's certainly not what I'm suggesting. But what I am suggesting is that your service delivery teams have sufficient awareness, and actually the processes that they're utilising are actually in line with what's in the agreements. And that way, you'll have much less issues for things like out of scope. I mean, if your team doesn't know what's out of scope, then it's an immediate problem there. But they need to have the confidence to say that's actually a project, or, that is a service we provide, but it's not a service we're currently providing to you. Now, as I've mentioned, that revenue leakage piece, at least 5% of revenue, and this is part of the issue right here. I've seen this go astray many times, both with managed service providers and on projects. And people can sometimes spend a lot of time, especially on larger projects. Prior to ITagree, I used to be involved in the drafting of agreements and the negotiation of very large ERP implementation projects and the like. And the amount of effort that went into those contracts, which was then not relayed on to the relevant people, meant that the benefit of what's in the agreements is not really utilised. Things around delays, or around change requests, or around acceptance processes. So we're seeing the same with managed service providers. Don't go to all the trouble of getting your agreements sorted out and then put them away and hope that they'll work for you in that worst case scenario. Actually utilise them in the way that you are running your businesses. Now, we're coming towards the end. Just this page on, are you turning a blind eye? And the example here of, the processes not being in sync with the customer, with the customer's agreements, with the agreement you have with the customer. And, we see it all the time. So the answer may well be right in front of you, but your team's response is to immediately, when I say right in front of you in the contract, if your team had worked in that way. But the team here in this example carries out the work without notifying the customer that it's out of scope. So effectively, you're absorbing that cost as part of the managed service. Again, a lot of the time, this is very well intended, of course, to keep the customer happy. And the customer probably will be happy because they're getting what they want. But the managed service is not going to be as profitable as it should be. And lo and behold, even if that was a small project and you're happy to absorb the cost of it, the customer then, you're blurring the boundaries on what is actually included in the managed service. The customer then has expectations that, anything similar, and the next task might come along and it's a slightly bigger project of the same type. They may well expect that would be part of the managed service as well. So then you're creating an issue for yourselves. So that now brings me almost to the end. I just wanted to slip in this page, let you know what ITagree is. And ITagree is the agreement lifeguard. We're not just providing agreements, but we really are looking out for the sorts of issues that are impacting managed service providers and other partners, the sorts of risks that go on, the challenges that you're facing, because we're talking to MSPs, not just in Asia Pacific, but in the US and UK all the time. As I mentioned, my background is that I'm an IT lawyer, and I could see that, it's very obvious people don't like working with contracts in the IT industry. It's one of the last things that people really like to do. So I wanted to make it easier. I went along to Microsoft and I said, your partners globally are struggling with agreements, and I want to provide agreement solutions. So it's not just the agreements, but it is a nice wraparound of guidance and support and agreement updates as well. So that brings me to the end, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have. We've now got 10 minutes left if anyone's got any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anne. That was good. There was a question in the chat from Adam on the question of T's and C's for different agreement types. Should they still be governed under a master services agreement?
Sorry, what was the question? I'm just trying to actually stop sharing here, but
the terms and conditions.
There we go.
Okay, I have just it's in the process of making everyone able to now turn on their microphone if they wish to ask a question directly. Adam asked if the T's and C's. Adam, are you still on the call? Did you want to ask?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Firstly, Anne, that was wonderful. That every single slide made sense to me, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of all of the MSPs saying a huge thank you. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you very much.
So the question really was, there was a slide where you spoke about having different contract types or agreement types. So my question really is, on the question of T's and C's for those different agreement types, should they all be governed under a master services agreement which has its own T's and C's, or does each agreement have its own T's and C's?
I tend to favour the latter. So each, there can be a bit of a hybrid approach, and we've got different suites of agreements, if you like. So, to make it easy, there are often, of course, terms and conditions that apply across the board. So we do have a suite where, and it's probably the most popular, where there's a master terms and conditions, and then there are different agreements that effectively sit under that, if you like. But it means that you're presenting out the service-specific agreement rather than the generic one. And, as I said earlier, if people don't read all those sorts of terms and conditions that are in your master, then that's fine. They can be kind of tucked away, and you're presenting them the part that you do want them to read. So, yes, there is certainly the place for a master terms and conditions or a master services agreement. But I think it's a trade-off with the master services agreement. You also don't want to make it more for the customer to do than really is needed. You want to keep it as smooth as possible. That said, sometimes people say, "Oh, can I have my contracts on 2 pages?" Well, it depends how small you want the font and which parts of the protection you want to leave out. But 2 pages is not usually going to cut it. So yeah, I certainly write the agreements in a way, and we've got quite a big range of agreements now based on what MSPs have asked us for. With in mind that you want a smooth process as well.
Yeah, that's really good. Just one little comment on that as well. What I see a lot of our peers or my peers doing is having that service-specific agreement delivered to the customer, and then a link to their master services agreement online. Is that something?
It's certainly doable. You need to, and more than doable. It's a good technique so long as it's done properly. Because if it's not done properly, then those terms and conditions that are linked may not form part of the contract and therefore not enforceable.
Yeah, got it.
Okay.
Huge thanks. Wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Susan's asked a question. Did you want to jump on the microphone, Susan, or are you okay with? So she's asked a master services agreement T's and C's with terms and conditions with service-specific ones overriding the master service terms and conditions if there is conflict. Obviously, we don't want conflict between the contracts we get the customers to sign, I'm guessing.
Well, there can sometimes be, and so yes, it's really important to set the order of precedence, as we call it, the priority between different things. So if you've got a master that's got a certain position on, let's say, one of the common areas would be on limitation of liability, and then you want to override that for a particular project, or for a particular client, or for your managed services, that gives you the ability to have that flexibility. But yes, the order of precedence needs to be clearly and carefully set.
So you'd have to, if you're overriding the master terms and conditions, you'd have to probably state that in the subsequent one that you're overriding it with, that it, in this particular case, it does the thing.
Well, it depends on what's in the order of precedence clause. So
right,
it depends. It depends. Yeah. So it depends on how it's drafted and how that interplay works. The contracts. Most contracts are a bit like a puzzle, and so you don't want to change one part without understanding the whole piece. And the order of precedence. Yes, if you are overriding something, it's really important to know that you're doing that and to make sure that what you are doing is actually going to take priority.
Okay, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, Susan,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Okay, the reason I'm not speaking is because everybody says I speak too quickly. So anyway, for a contract, we basically have an agreement page that tells you what are the various terms, what are the main points about an agreement. Like, for example, the price, the services are being included. Okay, and there's a little clause that says, in case that our general terms and conditions doesn't apply, we actually call it out right now. Okay, so I'm thinking of having like a separate service-specific terms and conditions that's in there. We could add that little clause again that refers, that says service agreement is, you're right, we're not trying to conflict, but sometimes services specific ones are really, really quite specific for that service, and it doesn't apply for most other scenarios. Okay, so from what you're saying, as long as we clearly establish what should be priority and what should be read first, that's actually okay.
Well, without having seen what you've got in there, yes. So the order of priority or the order of precedence clause need to be clearly set, and the way that the clause is written needs to reflect how you're permitted to do that overriding.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome.
Does anyone else have any questions for Anne? No?
I put my contact details on that last page, as well as if anyone wants to shoot me an email, they can do that. There's also a schedule a call button on our site. Any of you there are very welcome to book a call.
Hello, it's Bradley here. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
All right. So just hypothetically, I might be aware of master services agreements or master agreements that are 23 pages. Would you say that that's too lengthy of a document to have without the specific services agreement underneath that or associated with that?
No, not at all. Okay. Yeah, I think there is, if you think about it, the services that you're providing to your customers are essential to their business. Their business can't operate. So if you looked at it from the customer's perspective and you were running the business that your customer's running, would you want that to all be covered on a very, very short document? I wouldn't. I would want it to be laid out really, and carefully and fully and comprehensively as to what's actually happening. So 23 pages for a master services agreement, I certainly I wouldn't see that as long. It also depends, of course, on what's in it. So, and what size of clients you're dealing with and so on. But generally a master services agreement, there's quite a lot to include. And so they do tend to take a number of pages.
You mentioned 2 pages along the way, and I just thought, well, 23 is quite considerably greater than that.
Yeah. No, 2. That's at the extreme when that it's not. I mean, we couldn't fit everything on 2 pages. No, I think depending on what sort of agreement, it is, we don't have any agreements that are 2 pages. So they're more like 15, 20, that type of thing. If you think about managed services and everything that you need to include in a managed services agreement, there's a lot going on. And, for the sort of services that you're providing, generally, there's a lot to include in the agreements.
thank you very much for your input.
You're welcome.
Andrew asked about getting a copy of the recording. I will be getting that up onto our YouTube channel a little later today, and I will send everyone a link to view that so you can go over and review
Thanks,
and
Maria.
get in touch with Anne if you've got any questions that are raised from today. Okay, I think we're wrapping up. I will.
Okay.
Thank you